My wife took our daughter's trust fund and ran off with her lover. I was devastated until my year-old daughter said, "Don't worry, Dad, I took care of everything." 2 days later, my wife called screaming after she realized what our daughter had done. Tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from, big city, small town? We'd love to know. Now let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Shattered Trust. Roland Livingston sat at his mahogany desk in his home office reviewing blueprints for his latest architectural project. His fingers traced the clean lines of what would become his next masterpiece, a contemporary museum that would showcase both art and his innovative design philosophy. A notification pinging from his laptop interrupted his concentration. "You have a new message from England." The screen displayed. Roland clicked it open, expecting his daughter's usual quick update about her after-school activities. Instead, his eyes fixed on 4 simple words that would shatter his world. "Dad, check your laptop." He found a folder on his desktop innocuously labeled "Important." Inside were dozens of screenshots, messages, and emails. His daughter had captured them all through Brenda's phone. Intimate conversations between his wife and Scott Costa, the real estate developer who had been a frequent guest at their social gatherings. "I love you. Scott, Roland doesn't understand me like you do." One message. "Read, leave him. I'll give you everything you've ever wanted," Scott had replied. Roland's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white. 15 years of marriage reduced to betrayal in black and white on his screen. The messages dated back months, each one a calculated deception. A soft knock on his office door broke through his thoughts. Dad Inward's voice was barely above a whisper. "Come in, sweetheart." Roland managed his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Ingrid entered, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her eyes so much like his own, watching him carefully. At 15, she carried herself with a maturity beyond her years. "How long have you known?" Roland asked, maintaining his composure. 3 months? Ingrid replied, moving to stand beside his chair. "I noticed Mom acting weird with her phone. She jumped whenever you came near while she was testing, so too installed some monitoring software on her devices." Roland turned to face his daughter fully. "You shouldn't have had to do that. Someone had to watch your back." Ingrid said firmly, "There's more, Dad. I found something in Mom's email about my trust fund." Roland's expression darkened. "What about it?" Ingrid pulled up another file on his laptop. Bank statements appeared showing systematic withdrawals from the trust fund he'd established for her future. Brenda had been siphoning money, thousands of dollars at a time. "She's been taking money out for months," Ingrid explained. "Designer bags, jewelry, weekend trips." With him, Roland stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame rigid with controlled anger. His mind flashed back to their wedding day. 15 years ago, Brenda had been radiant and white, promising forever. He believed her then, had given her everything she'd ever wanted. "Dad," Inward's voice pulled him back to the present. "What are you going to do?" Roland placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Nothing yet. We wait, but trust me, sweetheart. Your mother thinks she's clever. Let's see just how clever she really is." That evening, Roland maintained his usual routine. He prepared dinner, set the table for 3, and waited. Brenda breezed in at 7, designer shopping bags in hand, her blonde hair perfectly styled. "Sorry I'm late," she announced, not sounding sorry at all. The interior design consultation for the Costa project ran long. Roland watched her, noting how easily the lies fell from her lips. "How, Scott?" he asked casually. "Fine," Brenda replied automatically, then froze. Her blue eyes snapped to his face, searching for any sign of what he knew. "Dinner is ready," Roland said smoothly, turning away. "Ingrid, come down, please." Throughout dinner, Roland observed his wife. She changed over the years, become harder, more entitled. The woman who had once laughed at his jokes and supported his dreams now saw him as nothing more than a means to an end. Later that night, as Brenda slept soundly beside him, Roland lay awake, his mind working. She thought she had it all figured out: take his money, take their daughter's future, take off with Scott Costa. But Roland Livingston hadn't built his reputation in architecture by being predictable or weak. The next morning brought the confrontation. Brenda stood in their bedroom, packing expensive clothes into a new suitcase, closed border. "I want a divorce," she announced, her chin lifted defiantly. "Scott and I have been planning this for months." Roland finished, his voice ice cold. "Did you think I wouldn't find out about the trust fund?" "Brenda?" Her composure slipped for just a moment. "You can't prove anything." Roland laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "I don't need to prove it. You've done all the work for me." "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll find out soon enough." Roland turned to leave, then paused. "And Brenda, remember, when you said I was too focused on work to notice you? You were right. I was focused on building something lasting. You were focused on destroying it." Brenda's face flushed with anger. "You think you're so perfect." "Roland Scott's twice the man you'll ever be. He knows what I'm worth." "No, he knows what my money is worth." "There's a difference." Roland's dark eyes fixed on her. "Pack your things and get out." But remember this moment, Brenda. Remember, when you thought you had one? He left her standing there, her perfectly manicured hands shaking as she zipped up her suitcase. Downstairs, Ingrid sat at the kitchen counter, her laptop open in front of her. She's leaving, Roland stated. Ingrid nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Don't worry, Dad, I took care of everything. What did you do? A small satisfied smile played at Ingrid's lips. Just wait for it. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Brenda's scream of rage echoed through Roland's phone. What did you do? She shrieked. All my accounts are blocked. My social media, everything's gone public. How dare you? Roland put the phone on speaker, so Ingrid could hear. I haven't done anything, Brenda, but it seems our daughter inherited more than just my eyes. This fix it now or I swear you'll. What? Roland's voice turned dangerous. Steal more from her trust fund. Run to Scott, go ahead, but remember you taught her that loyalty means nothing. Don't be surprised that she learned the lesson. So he ended the call and looked at his daughter. Ingrid sat straight back to unrepentant. I posted everything, Dad, the messages, the pictures, everything. I tagged all her friends, her social circle, Scott's business partners. Everyone knows what they did. Roland should have felt something, regret, perhaps, or concern about the ramifications. Instead, he felt only a cold satisfaction. Well done. Scott's wife has already commented, Ingrid added. Apparently we weren't the only ones he was lying to. Roland nodded, slowly. Keep monitoring their reactions. I want to know everything. As the day progressed, the fallout grew. Scott's business partners began distancing themselves publicly. Brenda's carefully curated social media presence crumbled as friends and acquaintances turned against her. Their phones buzzed constantly with messages, some supportive, others demanding explanations. Michael Dugan, Roland's best friend and lawyer, arrived that evening carrying a bottle of scotch and a grave expression. I saw what happened, he said as Roland led him in. Tell me you have a plan. Roland led him to the study where they could speak privately. I have several. Michael poured them both a drink. Roland, I've known you for 20 years. I know that. Look, whatever you're thinking, they try to take everything from me. Roland, cut in my marriage, my daughter's future, my reputation. They thought I would just accept it, roll over like a good husband and father. Taking the high road is for people who have never been betrayed. Roland's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. You're either with me on this, Michael, or you're not, but don't try to talk me out of it. Michael studied his friend for a long moment, then nodded. What do you need? Information? Everything you can find on Scott Costa, his business dealings, every permit, contract partner, and Brenda. I want to know where all that money really went. It won't be cheap. Money isn't an issue, justice is. They were interrupted by Ingrid, who entered carrying her laptop. Dad, you need to see this. Scott's threatening to sue me for defamation. He says he'll destroy us. Roland took the laptop, reading Scott's message with growing anger. The man's arrogance leaked through every word, threatening not just legal action but personal retribution. He won't touch you, Roland promised his daughter. Michael, how quickly can we move her trust fund somewhere safe? Give me 24 hours, Michael replied. But Roland, if you're planning what I think you are, I'm planning to teach them both a lesson about consequences. Roland's voice was quiet but filled with conviction. They thought they could play games with my life, my family. Now they'll learn what happens when you betray. Roland Livingston. That night, after Ingrid had gone to bed, and Michael had left with a list of tasks, Roland sat alone in his study. On his desk lay the stack of architectural awards he'd won over the years, each one a testament to his ability to see the bigger picture, to plan and execute. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd kept for emergencies. Alan, it's Roland Livingston. I need your services discreetly. He paused, listening. Yes, it's about Scott Costa and my wife, former wife. Another pause. No, I don't want to just win, Alan. I want to destroy them both. As he hung up, Roland allowed himself a small smile. Brenda and Scott thought they had written the ending to this story. They were about to learn. They'd only written the beginning. In her room, Ingrid sat cross-legged on her bed, multiple screens open before her. She'd always been quiet, observant, learning from both her parents, strengths and weaknesses. From her father she'd learned patience and precision. From her mother, she'd learned that trust once broken could never truly be repaired. Her fingers moved across the keyboard, setting up new monitoring protocols, creating alerts for any mention of their names online. She protected her father once, she would continue to protect him, no matter what came next, and something was coming. She could feel it in the way her father moved through the house now, in the steel beneath his calm words. Roland Livingston was planning something, and Ingrid knew whatever it was would change everything. In another part of town, Brenda sat in Scott's luxury apartment, her mascara streaked with tears of rage. He did this, she snarled, clutching her phone. Roland did this to humiliate us. Scott paced the room, his own phone buzzing constantly with messages from business partners and angry associates. No, your brat of a daughter did this, and you're going to fix it. How she's blocked me out of everything. I don't care how Scott grabbed her shoulders roughly. Do you have any idea what this could cost me? My reputation? My contracts? Brenda pulled away, suddenly seeing Scott clearly for the first time. Gone was the charming man who had promised her the world. In his place stood someone harder, colder. Will make them pay. She promised more to herself than to him. Roland thinks he's so clever, so controlled. We'll show him what real pain feels like. Neither of them realized they were playing exactly into Roland's hands, their anger and desperation driving them exactly where he wanted them to go. And Roland in his study was already moving his pieces into position, preparing for a game of revenge that would leave no survivors. Chapter 2. Don't worry, Dad. I took care of everything. The morning after Ingrid's cyber attack brought a tense atmosphere to the Livingston household. Roland stood in the kitchen preparing coffee with the same precision he applied to everything in his life when Brenda stormed in. We need to talk, she demanded, her designer outfit slightly disheveled, her usual perfect appearance showing cracks. Roland didn't turn around. About what? The affair, the money you stole from our daughter, or perhaps about how you thought you'd never get caught. Don't act superior with me. Roland. Brenda's voice dripped with disdain. You are always so wrapped up in your work, so focused on your precious reputation. What did you expect? Now Roland did turn, his dark eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her step back. What did I expect? Loyalty, perhaps basic decency, but then again, those concepts might be too complex for someone who measures worth in designer labels. I want a quick divorce, Brenda declared, trying to regain her composure. Scott's lawyers. Roland's laugh was sharp. The same Scott Costa, who's currently watching his business partnerships crumble because of his exposed affair. That's Scott. Brenda's face flushed. You have no proof of anything. It's all circumstantial in it. Roland pulled out his phone, bringing up screenshots of bank transfers. Like these transfers from Ingrid Trust Fund to your private account. The one you thought I didn't know about. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Brenda's face. How did you're not as clever as you think you are? Brenda? Neither is Scott. Roland's voice remained calm, almost conversational. What your biggest mistake was? Not the affair, not even stealing from our daughter. It was underestimating me. Is that supposed to frighten me? Brenda lifted her chin defiantly. You're nothing without me, Roland. I made you socially acceptable. I gave you the connections you needed. Roland stepped closer, his presence filling the kitchen. No, Brenda, I built everything we had. You just spin it, Dad. Ingrid's voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her school uniform, watching the scene with calculated interest. Brenda turned to her daughter, her expression softening artificially. Ingrid, sweetheart, you need to understand. I understand perfectly, Mom. Ingrid cut in, her voice cold. I understand how you used Dad's credit cards to book hotel rooms with Scott. I understand how you transferred money from my college fund to buy designer bags. I understand everything you little. Brenda started forward, but Roland's hands shot out, gripping a wrist. Don't, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. Don't even think about it. Brenda jerked away, rubbing her wrist. Fine. Keep your little spy. You deserve each other. She stormed upstairs, returning minutes later with a suitcase. I'll have my lawyers contact yours, she announced from the doorway. Don't think this is over, Roland. After she left, Ingrid moved to stand beside her father. She's right about one thing, she said quietly. It's not over. Roland placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. No, it's not, but we're ready for whatever comes next. Throughout the day, Roland maintained an appearance of defeat, playing the role of the betrayed husband perfectly. He fielded calls from concerned friends and business associates, his responses measured and diplomatic. Michael arrived in the afternoon carrying a stack of legal documents. I've started the process, he reported, spreading papers across Roland's desk. But Roland, you need to be prepared. Brenda is going to fight dirty letter. Roland examined the documents. What did you find about Scott's business dealings? Michael pulled out another file. It's interesting. His latest development project, the safety inspections are questionable at best. The funding, there are discrepancies. Good. Roland smiled and reached his eyes. Keep digging. I want everything. A notification sound from inwards. Laptop interrupted them. She had been sitting quietly in the corner monitoring social media and electronic communications. Dad, Ingrid called, her eyes fixed on the screen. Scott's posted something, a threat. Roland and Michael moved to read over her shoulder. The message was public, posted on Scott's business profile to those spreading malicious lies about my personal life. Remember that reputations aren't the only things that can be destroyed. Your actions have consequences. He's desperate. Michael observed the exposure is hitting him where it hurts. Good, Roland replied. Let him show his true colors. 2 days passed in relative calm before the storm truly hit. Brenda's phone call came during dinner, her voice shrill with panic and rage. What have you done? She screamed. All my cards are declined, my accounts are locked, and those pictures, those messages. Roland put the phone on speaker. Having trouble with your finances, Brenda? You bastard. Do you know what you've done? The entire city is talking about us. Scott's wife is filing for divorce. His investors are pulling out. Actually, Ingrid interrupted, her voice clear and calm. I did that every message secret meeting penny you stole. I made sure everyone knows. Silence filled the line for a moment. Then Brenda's voice returned, deadly, quiet. You ungrateful litter, choose your next words very carefully. Roland warned, his tone making even Michael shift uncomfortably. You've already stolen from her. You don't get to insult her too. I'm your mother, Brenda hissed at Ingrid. Everything I did was for us, for our future. No. Ingrid cut in, everything you did was for yourself, and now everyone knows it. After the call ended, Michael looked at Roland with concern. They're going to retaliate, that right? Roland nodded. I'm counting on it. Chapter 3, Seeds of a Ruthless Plan. The next morning brought the expected escalation. Scott Costa's lawyer contacted Roland's office threatening legal action for defamation and interference with business relationships. Minutes later, Brenda's lawyer followed with demands for an immediate and generous divorce settlement. Roland sat in his home office examining the threats with Michael. They're playing right into our hands, he observed. Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. I've known you long enough to know when you're planning something. What exactly are we doing here? Roland stood, moving to the window. Do you remember when we were in college and my business partner tried to steal our first major project? Michael nodded. You spent 6 months gathering evidence before destroying him completely. I learned something then, Roland continued. When someone betrays, you don't just defeat them. You make sure they never recover. A knock at the door interrupted them. Ingrid entered, carrying her laptop. Dad, I found something interesting in Mom's email history. She's been talking to Alexandra Hubbard about Scott's business dealings. Alexandra. Michael frowned. Isn't she Brenda's closest friend? Supposedly, Ingrid replied, turning her laptop to show them. But look at these messages. She's been feeding Mom's ego, encouraging the affair, all while gathering information about both Mom and Scott. Roland's eyes narrowed as he read the exchanges. She's playing both sides. Keep monitoring their communications. Ingrid. Alexandra might prove useful. The afternoon brought another development. Scott and Brenda appeared at Roland's office unannounced, their faces tight with barely controlled rage. You think you can destroy us? Scott demanded, his usual smooth demeanor cracking. I'll burn everything you've built to the ground. Roland remained seated, his posture relaxed. Mr. Costa, I understand you're upset. Finding out your business partners are abandoning you must be distressing. This isn't a game, Brenda snapped. Fix this, Roland. Call off your attack dog of a daughter, or what? Roland's voice turned to ice. You'll steal more from her. Try to ruin more lives. He stood slowly. You both seem to be operating under a misunderstanding. You think this is the worst it can get. It's not. Is that a threat? God stepped forward aggressively. No, Mr. Costa, it's a promise. Rollins, dark eyes fixed on him. You took my wife. You helped her steal from my daughter. You thought you could tear apart my family with no consequences. Now you'll learn how wrong you were. After they left, Michael poured them both a drink. You're playing a dangerous game. Roland. Scott Costa has connections we don't know about. I know, Roland replied. That's why I've already contacted Alan Trujillo, the shark. Michael whistled. He doesn't come cheap. No, he doesn't, but he's the best at what he does. Roland sipped his drink. While you've been investigating Scott's business dealings, Alan's been tracking his personal life. The skeletons are starting to emerge from their closets. Later that night, Roland sat alone in his study, memories washing over him. He remembered meeting Brenda in college, her laugh, her dreams. He remembered their wedding day, the promises they had made. He remembered the moment he realized she changed, becoming obsessed with status and wealth. Ingrid found him there, still working past midnight. Dad, I've been thinking about something. What is it? Sweetheart, Alexandra Hubbard? She's been gathering dirt on Scott and Mom for months, but she's also been collecting information about you. Roland's expression hardened. Show me. Ingrid pulled up a series of emails on her laptop. Alexander had been meticulously documenting everything. Roland's business dealings, his social connections, even his daily routines. She's playing a longer game. Roland mused. Keep watching her, Ingrid. She might think she's clever, but she's just given us another weapon to use. As the night deepened, Roland's plan took shape. He would need to move carefully, strategically. Scott and Brenda had thrown the first punch thinking they held all the power. Now he would show them what real power looked like. Dad? Ingrid's voice was soft. Are you? Roland looked at his daughter, seeing the strength and loyalty that reminded him so much of himself. I'm fine, sweetheart. We're going to be fine. But as Ingrid left for bed, Roland's expression darkened. He pulled out his phone and dialed Alan's number. It's time, he said when the lawyer answered. Start the process. I want everything in place before they know what hit them. The first act of Roland's revenge was complete. The betrayal had been exposed, the battle lines drawn. Now came the real war. And Roland Livingston never lost a war in her room. Ingrid continued monitoring the digital battlefield she created. She'd watched her father all her life, learning his strength, his attention to detail, his unforgiving nature toward betrayal. Now she would help him ensure that Brenda and Scott learned the same lesson. She had never underestimate Roland Livingston. The seeds of revenge had been planted. The storm was coming, and when it hit, no one who had betrayed the Livingstones would be left standing. Chapter 4: Financial Ruin. Roland sat in Alan Drew Heal's office examining the stack of documents spread across the mahogany desk. Each paper represented a different aspect of Scott Costa's business empire, and each one revealed new vulnerabilities. "Your friend Michael did excellent work," Alan said, tapping a particular file. "These safety violations that Costa's newest development. They're not just infractions, they're criminal negligence." Roland's dark eyes scanned the reports. "How quickly can we move anonymous tips to the regulatory boards?" Alan's thin lips curved into a predatory smile. "They'll be on site by tomorrow morning." "But Roland, once we start this, there's no going back." "I know." Roland leaned forward. "Scott Costa tried to take everything from me. Now I'll take everything from him." The next day, Roland watched from his office as news crews descended on Costa Development's flagship project. Construction halted as inspectors swarmed the site, their presence drawing the attention of investors and board members alike. His phone buzzed, a message from England. "Dad, Scott's stock just dropped 15% in the first hour of trading." Roland's response was simple: "Keep watching." The dominoes fell exactly as planned. By weeks, and 3 of Scott's major projects faced regulatory shutdown. His business partners, sensing blood in the water, began distancing themselves. Each revelation led to another. Each investigation spawned 2 more. Michael arrived at Roland's house that evening carrying files and a grim expression. "The audit reports came back on those boutiques Brenda frequents. You were right. Their books are a mess. Anonymous tip already done. IRS is particularly interested in their cash handling procedures." Michael poured himself a drink. "Roland, Brenda is going to be cut off from her favorite shopping spots." "Good." Roland examined a document showing Brenda's recent purchases. "She always did love spending other people's money. Let's see how she manages when the wells run dry." In her room, Ingrid monitored the digital fallout. Social media buzzed with rumors about Costa Development's troubles, but something caught her attention. A series of worried posts from her father's investors. "Dad," she found him in a study, "I think we have a problem. People are starting to wonder if your projects might have similar issues." Roland nodded, unsurprised. "Alan's already handling it. Full transparency. We're opening our books and sites for inspection. Unlike Scott, we have nothing to hide." The phone rang. Scott Costa's private number. Roland put it on speaker. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Scott's voice trembled with rage. "These anonymous tips. Problems with the inspector, Scott. That's unfortunate. Perhaps if you'd spent more time overseeing construction and less time pursuing other men's wives, I'll destroy you for this. Better men than you have tried." Roland's voice remained calm. "How's the stock price looking?" Scott's response was pure profanity. Roland ended the call, turning to find Ingrid watching him. "He sounds scared," she observed. "He should be." Roland pulled up a document on his computer. "Because tomorrow his board receives this." The document detailed years of corner-cutting safety violations and fraudulent inspections. Each accusation backed by documentation Michael had uncovered. "But the real blow," Roland continued, "comes from here." He opened another file, emails between Scott and various officials suggesting bribes and kickbacks. Ingrid studied the evidence. "Where did you get all this?" "Scott's not the only one with connections, but he is the only one stupid enough to leave a paper trail." The next morning, Roland received an urgent call from Alan. "It's done. The board called an emergency meeting. They're voting to suspend Scott pending investigation." "The other matter, your ex-wife's favorite boutiques. 3 of them just got visits from tax auditors. The others are scheduled for next week." Roland ended the call satisfied. The financial news was tightening around both Scott and Brenda, but this was just the beginning. A text from Michael arrived. "You need to see this." Attached was a video. Brenda attempting to use her credit cards at a high-end store, becoming increasingly agitated as each one was declined. The footage, likely from security cameras, showed her screaming at the staff before security escorted her out. "Should we leak it?" Michael asked in a follow-up message. "Not yet," Roland replied. "Let her humiliation be private." For now, that afternoon, Roland met with his own investors, addressing their concerns head-on. Unlike Scott's panicked attempts at damage control, Roland presented facts, figures in full transparency. "I understand your concerns," he told them, his voice steady and confident. "That's why I've invited independent auditors to examine all our projects. Unlike some in our industry, we have nothing to hide." The meeting ended with renewed confidence in Roland's leadership. As the investors filed out, one stayed behind. "Costa tried to contact me. The investor said quietly wanted to discuss moving some projects to his company. Rollins' expression didn't change, and I told him I don't do business with sinking ships. Meanwhile, across town, Brenda faced her own crisis. Her regular salon had suddenly lost her appointment. Her favorite boutique was temporarily closed for audit. Even her preferred restaurants seemed to have permanently full reservations. She stormed into the country club only to be stopped at the door. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Livingston," the manager said, not sounding sorry at all. "Your membership appears to have been suspended. Do you know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am, that's precisely the problem." Humiliated, Brenda retreated to Scott's penthouse only to find him in the midst of his own meltdown. "They suspended me," he shouted, throwing a crystal tumbler against the wall. "My own board, they're talking about a criminal investigation." "Scott, calm down. We need to think. Think while your ex-husband systematically destroys everything I've built." Scott rounded on her. "Fix this, Brenda. You promised me Roland was weak, that he'd roll over." "I didn't think he didn't think at all." Scott grabbed her arm roughly. "If I go down, you go down with me." Remember that back at the Livingston house, Roland reviewed the day's developments with Michael and Alan. "Costa's board suspended him," Alan reported. "The regulatory investigations have spooked them. There's talk of bringing in forensic accountants," Michael added, "and those boutiques Brenda frequency. 3 have already received audit notices. The others are scrambling to clean up their books." "Good." Roland examined a new set of documents. "What about Alexandra Hubbard, still playing both sides?" Michael confirmed. "She's been feeding information about Brenda to her social circle while pretending to be supportive." "Perfect." Roland's smile was cold. "Let's give her more ammunition." It's time. Everyone knew exactly who Brenda Livingston really is. The next phase of Rollins' plan was ready. Financial ruin was just the beginning. Now came the true destruction of everything. Scott and Brenda held dear. Chapter 5, Psychological Warfare. Rollins' campaign shifted from financial to psychological warfare with the precision of a master strategist. He began by arranging a series of chance encounters between Brenda and her former social circle. "Did you hear?" one socialite loudly asked another as Brenda entered her favorite cafe. They found irregularities in all those boutiques she frequented. Apparently someone was helping them dodge taxes in exchange for special arrangements. Brenda froze, her face flushing as whispers and stares followed her. She fled the cafe only to face similar scenes wherever she went. Roland watched from afar as his ex-wife, social world crumbled. Each calculated revelation, each leaked piece of information drove wedges between Brenda and her former friends. Alexandra Hubbard proved particularly useful in this phase. She visited Rollins' office one afternoon, eager to play her part in the destruction. "Brenda is desperate," Alexandra reported, satisfaction evident in her voice. "She tried to arrange a lunch with the charity board yesterday. They all had other commitments." "How unfortunate," Roland replied, his tone neutral. "And Scott, they fight constantly. Now, he blames her for his business troubles, says she promised you wouldn't fight back." Alexandra leaned forward. "I could tell you more." "I'm sure you could." Rollins' dark eyes studied her. "Tell me, Alexandra, how long have you been collecting information on my wife?" She stiffened slightly. "I'm just trying to help." "No, you're trying to position yourself to benefit from her downfall." His voice remained calm. "That's fine. Keep doing exactly what you're doing. But remember, I know exactly what game you're playing." The threat? Subtle but clear. In short, Alexandra has continued cooperation while reminding her of her place in this scheme. Later that day, Scott Costa made his move. He burst into Rollins' office, security close behind. "You think you're so clever," Scott snarled, "turning my own board against me, freezing my project." "Mr. Costa," Roland interrupted, not bothering to stand unless you have a warrant or an appointment. "You're trespassing. This is an over Livingston. You think you can destroy me? I've got friends." "You can't imagine friends." Rollins' laugh was cold. "You mean the board members who suspended you, or perhaps the investors who are dropping your stock like toxic waste?" Scott's face reddened. "You smug bastard." "Security," Roland called calmly. "Mr. Costa was just leaving." As Scott was escorted out, he shouted back, "Watch your back, Livingston, and watch that precious daughter of yours." Rollins' expression darkened. He picked up his phone. "Michael, increasing grid security and contact Alan. It's time for Phase 2. Phase 2 began with a series of anonymous emails as Scott's remaining business partners. Each contained documentation of his questionable practices. Each suggested deeper investigations. Dad Ingrid entered his study that evening. Scott's wife is giving interviews. She's talking about his affairs, all of them. Roland watched the footage. Scott's wife, tears in her eyes, detailing years of infidelity and financial manipulation. The comment section exploded with sympathy for her and condemnation for Scott. Keep monitoring the response, Roland instructed, and Brenda's social media. Complete meltdown. She's posting angry rats, deleting them, then posting more. Alexandra's screenshots are spreading everywhere. The psychological pressure mounted. Scott's former friends avoided him. Business associates stopped returning calls. His social standing, once built on wealth and influence, crumbled. Brenda faced similar isolation. Her attempts to maintain her social position met with polite but firm rejection. Even her favorite stores suddenly couldn't accommodate her. "This is your fault," she screamed at Scott during another fight in his penthouse. "You promised me everything, and now I have nothing." Scott grabbed her shoulders roughly. "You said he was weak. You said he'd never fight back. Now look, my company is under investigation. My reputation's ruined your reputation." Brenda laughed hysterically. "I can't even get a dinner reservation. My own friends won't take my calls." "Friends?" Scott sneered. "You mean those socialite who only wanted your money? Or that snake Alexander who's been spreading stories about you?" The mention of Alexandra sent Brenda into a fresh rage. She trusted Alexandra, confided in her only to discover her former friend had been documenting and sharing every mistake and indiscretion. Roland received regular updates on their deteriorating relationship from various sources. Each fight, each public scene, each desperate attempt to maintain their lifestyle played exactly into his hands. "They're turning on each other," Michael observed during one of their strategy sessions. "Scott's blaming Brenda for his business troubles. She's blaming him for her social isolation." "Good." Roland examined new reports from his investigators. "The pressure is working. Now we increase it." The next phase of psychological warfare targeted their individual weaknesses. For Scott, it was his pride and his business acumen. Anonymous tips led journalists to investigate his past projects, revealing pattern after pattern of corner-cutting and fraud. For Brenda, the target was her social status, carefully planted. Rumors suggested she had been living beyond her means even before the affair, manipulating both Roland and Scott for financial gain. "Sir Rollins," assistant interrupted one afternoon. "Mrs. Costa is here to see you." Scott's wife entered, elegant despite her obvious distress. "Mr. Livingston, second, have information you might want about your husband, about all of it. His business practices, his affairs, his plans with your wife." She placed a USB drive on his desk. "I thought I could save our marriage. Now I just want him to pay." Roland examined the drive. "Why come to me?" "Because you're winning," she replied simply, "and I want to be on the winning side." The drive contained years of Scott's personal and business correspondence, a goldmine of information for Rollins' campaign. But it was the psychological impact that mattered most. Scott's own wife turning against him. The pressure continued to mount. Scott's remaining business partners received anonymous emails detailing his fraudulent practices. Brenda's social circle buzzed with new revelations about her manipulation of both husbands. Alexander played her part perfectly, sharing just enough information to maintain her position while fueling the flames of scandal. She didn't realize she was being used just as effectively as she thought she was using others. "Dad," Ingrid's voice pulled Roland from his strategic planning. "I think you need to see this." She showed him her phone. A social media post from Brenda, clearly written in a moment of desperate rage. "You think you've won, Roland? You think you can destroy us? Watch your back. Watch your precious daughter." "This isn't over." Roland's expression hardened. The threat to Ingrid crossed a line he wouldn't tolerate. It was time to escalate the warfare, to move from psychological pressure to complete destruction. He picked up his phone. "Alan, move up the timeline. It's time for the press conference." The psychological warfare had served its purpose, breaking down their defenses, isolating them from support, turning them against each other. Now came the final phase: public humiliation and complete ruin. Chapter 6. The public humiliation. The press conference was set for a Tuesday morning at the city's most prestigious hotel. Roland had chosen the venue carefully. It was where Scott Costa had hosted his company's most successful events, where he'd smoothed with investors and politicians. Now it would be where his world ended. "Are you sure about this?" Michael asked as they reviewed the presentation one final time. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "They threatened my daughter," Roland replied, his voice cold. "Now they learn what that means." The ballroom filled with journalists, business reporters, and social media influences. Roland had ensured maximum coverage. This destruction would be witnessed by everyone who mattered. Alan Trujillo stood at the podium first, his presence lending gravitas to what was to come. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Today, we present evidence of systematic fraud, corruption, and criminal negligence at the highest levels of Costa development." The screens behind him lit up with documents, emails, and photographs. Each piece of evidence had been carefully selected and verified. There would be no possibility of denial. "These records show a pattern of safety violations spanning 5 years. Alan continued. "Mr. Costa personally approved cost-cutting measures that put lives at risk." In the audience, phones buzzed as Costa development stock price began to plummet. The real-time destruction of Scott's empire played out in digits and decimal points. Then came the personal revelations, emails between Scott and various officials suggesting bribes and kickbacks, messages to multiple mistresses including Brenda, revealing promises of wealth and status in exchange for their affections. Mr. Costa didn't just betray his investors. Alan announced he betrayed his wife, his business partners and the public trust. From her seat in the audience, Alexandra Hubbard recorded everything, her social media followers growing by the minute as she provided real-time commentary. She didn't realize her role in this drama was far from over halfway through the presentation. Scott Costa burst into the ballroom, his face contorted with rage. "This is slander. I'll sue you all." Roland stepped to the podium, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Scott's fury. "Mr. Costa, would you care to explain these documents?" He gestured to the screen where Scott's signature appeared on falsified safety reports. "This is a setup." Scott launched forward, but security intercepted him. "Livingston, you orchestrated this whole thing." "I orchestrated nothing. Mr. Costa, your own actions, your own signatures, your own decisions, they speak for themselves." Roland's voice carried throughout the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, there's more. The next series of slides detail Brenda's involvement, her knowledge of the fraudulent practices, her role in entertaining potential investors, the money trail leading from Costa Development through various shell companies and into her personal accounts." In the back of the room, Brenda stood frozen, watching her reputation crumble in real time. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from former friends, each one distancing themselves from the growing scandal. "This evidence has been provided to the relevant authorities," Alan announced. "We expect formal investigations to begin immediately." As security escorted a still shouting Scott from the ballroom, Roland maintained his professional demeanor. He took questions from reporters, each answer calculated to drive home the magnitude of Scott and Brenda's deceptions. "Mr. Livingston," one reporter called out, "did you have any indication of these activities during your marriage?" "My focus was on building legitimate businesses and providing for my family," Roland replied. The betrayal of trust, both personal and professional, came as a shock. After the press conference, Roland met with Michael and Alan in a private room. "Done," Michael said, checking his phone. "Costa Development stock has been suspended from trading. The board's calling for his immediate resignation, and Brenda already receiving calls from the IRS about her financial dealings with Scott," Allen reported. "The boutiques she frequented are also under investigation for tax fraud and money laundering." Roland nodded, satisfied. "Now we wait for the real damage to begin." The aftermath was swift and brutal. By evening, major news networks ran stories about Costa Development's fraudulent practices. Social media exploded with screenshots of Scott's emails and Brenda's extravagant spending. Brenda's desperate phone call came just before midnight. "You've ruined everything," she sobbed. "My friends, my reputation. How could you do this to me?" "I did nothing to you, Brenda. You did this to yourself." Roland's voice remained steady. "You chose to betray your family. You chose to steal from your daughter. You chose Scott Costa. Now you can live with those choices." "Please, Roland, I need help. Money just temporarily. Goodbye, Brenda." He ended the call and turned to find Ingrid standing in his study doorway. "She called you for money." His daughter's voice held a mix of disbelief and contempt. She always did care more about wealth and loyalty. Roland gestured for Ingrid to join him. "Are you okay with all this?" "They threatened us, Dad. They threatened me." Ingrid's expression hardened. "They deserve everything they get." The next few days brought a cascade of consequences. Scott's business partners filed lawsuits, regulatory agencies launched formal investigations. His wife filed for divorce, armed with evidence of his infidelities and financial misconduct. Brenda found herself shunned by her former social circle. Alexandra Hubbard, playing her role perfectly, continued to share details of Brenda's fall from grace, while maintaining a facade of concerned friendship. "Your plan worked perfectly," Michael observed during a strategy meeting. "They're completely isolated. The reputations are destroyed, and it's all from their own actions." "Almost perfectly," Roland corrected. "There's still the matter of Alexandra Hubbard. What about her? She played her part, but she's a loose end. Someone that comfortable with betrayal can't be trusted." Roland pulled up a file on his computer. "She's been gathering information on everyone involved, thinking she'll profit from all sides. Time to show her the cost of playing those games." The final phase of Act 2 was set in motion. Scott and Brenda were ruined, their world shattered by their own actions and arrogance. But Roland Livingston's revenge wasn't quite complete. There were still pieces to be moved, consequences to be delivered. Alexandra Hubbard would learn that her manipulative games had consequences. Scott Costa would discover that financial ruin was just the beginning. Brenda would finally understand exactly what she had thrown away. The execution of retribution was nearly complete, but the storm wasn't over yet. Roland had orchestrated their downfall. Now he would watch as they tore each other apart in their desperate attempts to survive. In his study, Roland reviewed the day's reports with satisfaction. His enemies had thought him weak, had underestimated his capacity for revenge. That mistake had cost them everything: their wealth, their status, their relationships, their futures. Dad, Ingrid entered with her laptop. Scott is trying to leave the country. His private jet filed a flight plan for tomorrow morning. Roland smiled coldly. Send the information to Alan. Let's see how far Mr. Costa gets. The stage was set for the final act of his revenge, but that would be another chapter. Another calculated strike against those who would dare to threaten his family. For now, Roland Livingston sat in his study surrounded by the evidence of his enemy's destruction and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The execution of retribution was complete. The reckoning would come next. Chapter 7: Ruthless Retaliation. The security footage played on Roland's laptop screen. Scott Costa approaching Ingrid's school, attempting to get past the guards. His daughter's frightened call still rang in Roland's ears. Dad, he was here. He tried to. Roland's fingers tightened on his desk until his knuckles turned white. The line had been crossed. Scott Costa had made the fatal mistake of threatening his daughter. I want everything. Roland spoke into his phone: tax records, business dealings, personal accounts, anything that isn't completely legal. I want it now, already on it. Alan Drew Heel replied. But Roland, if we move this aggressively, I don't care about legal consequences anymore. He tried to hurt my daughter. Roland ended the call and turned to Michael, who sat watching him with concern. Whatever you're planning. Michael said, I'm with you. Good, because this ends now. Roland pulled up a series of documents on his computer. Contact our private investigator. I want to know everything about Scott's business connections, especially the ones he keeps hidden. The investigator's report arrived within hours. Scott Costa's empire wasn't built solely on legal construction projects. There were shadow companies, hidden accounts, connections to questionable organizations. Roland smiled coldly. Perfect. He began his assault with surgical strikes at Scott's weakest points. Anonymous tips to regulatory agencies revealed critical safety violations in Costa's buildings. Building inspectors descended on his properties, finding countless code violations that required immediate attention. Sir Roland's assistant interrupted his planning. The first demolition crew has arrived at Costa's Riverside project. Roland stood at his office window watching as the wrecking balls took down Scott's pride and joy. A luxury apartment complex that had cut corners on structural integrity. His phone buzzed, Ingrid sending him a video link. The demolition was being live-streamed with comments pouring in about Costa Development's negligence. Dad? Ingrid entered his office, her laptop under her arm. Scott is trying to access his offshore accounts. Should I block him? Roland commanded. Freeze everything. Ingrid's fingers flew over her keyboard. Done. He's locked out of all his financial resources. The next phase targeted Brenda. Roland had compiled a detailed dossier of her past, including photos from her college days when she struggled to make ends meet. He arranged for these images to reach her social circle, along with records of her recent financial manipulations. Please, Brenda's voice cracked over the phone. Roland, you have to stop this. I have nothing left. Roland's voice turned arctic. You still have your life. Be grateful for that. You helped Scott threaten our daughter. I didn't know he would. Goodbye, Brenda. Later that day, Michael brought more news. Scott's business partners are turning on him. They're filing lawsuits claiming they were misled about the company's practices. Roland nodded, satisfied. And the authorities' tax fraud investigation is underway. The evidence we provided was compelling. A notification pinged on Roland's computer, an email from one of Scott's former associates containing years of documented bribes and kickbacks. The man was trying to save himself by offering evidence against his former boss. Send this to Alan, Roland instructed. It's time to bring in the federal investigators. The next morning brought chaos to Scott's world. Federal agents raided Costa Development's offices, carrying out boxes of documents. News crews captured it all, broadcasting Scott's downfall in real time. Dad? Inward's voice was quiet. Scott's at the airport. He's trying to leave the country. Roland picked up his phone. Alan, execute Plan B. Within hours, Scott Costa found himself in handcuffs, his attempt to flee thwarted by authorities who had been tipped off about his plans. You did this, Scott screamed as they led him away. I'll kill you, Livingston. I'll destroy everything you love. Roland watched the footage of Scott's arrest with cold satisfaction. No, Scott, you destroyed yourself. That evening, Roland met with Michael in his study. There's still the matter of those threats we've been receiving. Michael shifted uncomfortably. About that, I need to tell you something, but before he could continue, Roland's security system alerted him to an intruder. On the cameras, he saw men in dark clothing approaching his house. Get Ingrid to the safe room, Roland commanded. Now, the next hours would prove that Roland Livingston's reputation for ruthlessness was well earned. Scott's hidden connections had made their move, but Roland was more than ready. Chapter 8: The Price of Vengeance. Roland stood in his office examining the aftermath of the previous night's attempted invasion. His security team had handled the situation efficiently, and now Scott's hired thugs were in police custody. A knock at his door revealed Alexandra Hubbard looking polished as always, despite the early hour. "Roland, I heard about what happened. I have information you might find useful." "Come in." Alexandra Rollins' voice was pleasant but his eyes were calculating. "Tell me about your arrangement with Scott." She faltered slightly. "I don't know what you—" "Please," Roland interrupted, sliding a folder across his desk. "Let's not waste time with denials. I have copies of all your communications." Alexandra's composure cracked. "I was just trying to protect myself. You have to understand." "I understand perfectly. You played both sides, feeding information to whoever you thought would win." Roland leaned forward. "But you made a mistake. You assumed I wouldn't find out. What are you going to do?" Roland smiled, the expression devoid of warmth. "Nothing. I'm going to do nothing at all. Your friends, your social circle, they'll do it for me once they see these." He tapped the folder. "You can't. I already have. Check your phone." Alexandra's phone buzzed with notifications. Her betrayals, her manipulations, her attempts to profit from both sides. All of it was now public knowledge. "How does it feel?" Roland asked quietly, "to lose everything you built through betrayal, leaving Alexandra to her destruction?" Roland moved to his next target. Brenda had been quiet lately, too quiet. His phone rang. Michael with an update. "She's trying to sell her story to the tabloids, painting herself as the victim." Perfect. Roland had anticipated this move, released the recordings hours later. Audio files flooded social media. Brenda's own voice revealing her calculated manipulation of both Roland and Scott, her theft from her daughter's trust fund, her cold dismissal of family ties in favor of wealth. The final blow came from an unexpected source. Scott's wife held a press conference revealing years of manipulation by both Scott and Brenda. They thought they could play with people's lives. She told the cameras destroy families for their own gain. They were wrong. Roland watched the coverage from his office, injured beside him. "Was it worth it?" His daughter asked quietly. "They threatened you." Roland replied, "That made it necessary." The phone rang. Brenda again, but this time her voice was different, broken. "I understand now," she whispered, "what I threw away, what I lost." "Roland, please, no." His voice was final. "You chose this path." Brenda now walked it alone. Later that evening, news broke that Scott Costa had tried to strike a deal with prosecutors, offering evidence against his business partners in exchange for leniency. "It won't work." Alan reported, "The evidence against him is too strong. He's facing serious time." Roland nodded, satisfied. "And Brenda, the IRS is very interested in her financial activities, tax fraud, money laundering. She'll be lucky to avoid jail." A noise from the hallway made roll. In turn, Alexandra stood there, her usual Polish gone replaced by desperate anger. "You destroyed me." She accused my friends, my reputation. "You destroyed yourself," Roland corrected. "I merely showed everyone who you really are." As security escorted her out, Roland reflected on the price of vengeance. He had won completely and utterly. His enemies were ruined, their lives destroyed by their own actions and his calculated exposure of their true nature. Michael found him there later, pouring them both a drink. "We need to talk about those threats," he said seriously, "about the protection I arranged." Roland looked at his oldest friend, understanding dawning. "You've been handling it all along, haven't you?" Michael nodded. "I couldn't let them hurt you or Ingrid. I made some arrangements, called in some favors." "Thank you," Roland said, simply meaning it. The price of vengeance had been high, but Roland Livingston had paid it willingly. His enemies had learned the cost of betrayal and his family was safe. That was all that mattered. Chapter 9. New Beginnings and Lasting Closure. 6 months later, Roland stood in his new office overlooking a different city skyline. The move had been necessary not out of fear, but for a fresh start. "Mr. Livingston," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Margie Cherry from the Daily Chronicle is here." Roland had been expecting this. The journalist had been persistent in her pursuit of the story, and now he was ready to tell it. "Send her in." Margie entered, recorder in hand. "Thank you for finally agreeing to meet with me. You've been thorough in your investigation," Roland acknowledged. "What would you like to know?" "The truth," she replied simply, "about what really happened to Scott Costa and Brenda Livingston." Roland gestured for her to sit. "The truth is simple. They betrayed the wrong person." Over the next hour, he laid out the story, not all of it, but enough. He told her about the affair, the theft from his daughter's trust fund, the threats against his family. And now, Margie asked, "Scott Costa is in prison. Brenda Livingston is facing charges. Their social circle is destroyed. Do you regret any of it?" "No," Roland's voice was firm. "They chose their path. I simply ensured they faced the consequences." After the interview, Roland found Ingrid in the building's tech center she designed. His daughter had grown over the past year, becoming stronger, more confident. "I read the draft of your college application essay," he said. "It's powerful." Ingrid smiled slightly. "I wrote about loyalty, about learning what really matters in life." Roland nodded, proud of the woman his daughter was becoming. She had weathered the storm with him, proven her strength and intelligence. A notification on his phone caught his attention. Michael sending him an update about Scott's latest appeal being denied. Costa would serve his full sentence for fraud and attempted intimidation. Dad? Inward's voice pulled him back. Are you happy now with how everything turned out? Roland considered the question carefully. I'm at peace, he answered. Finally, we're safe. We're together. And those who threatened us can never hurt us again. Later that day, he met with Michael for their regular dinner. His friend had finally told him the full story of how he protected them from Scott's criminal connections, the alliances he'd made to keep them safe. You didn't have to do all that, Roland said. I did. Michael's voice was firm. Your family. The conversation turned to their new charitable foundation focused on helping children from broken homes. It had been Ingrid's idea, turning their experience into something positive. She's remarkable, Michael observed. After everything that happened, she's thinking about helping others. Roland agreed, pride evident in his voice. She's stronger than all of us. As they talked, Roland's phone buzzed with a news alert. Brenda's trial date had been set. His ex-wife would face justice for her financial crimes, her carefully constructed world of privilege completely destroyed. Any regrets? Michael asked quietly. Roland thought about the past year, the betrayal, the revenge, the consequences. No, he said finally. They made their choices. I simply made sure they lived with them. The evening ended with Roland returning home to find Ingrid working on the foundation's website. She looked up as he entered, her expression serious. I saw the news about Mom, she said. Are you okay? I am. Roland sat beside her. Are you? Yes? Inward's voice was firm. She chose money and status over family. That was her mistake. Roland looked at his daughter, seeing the strength and wisdom she gained through their ordeal. They had survived, emerged stronger, while those who betrayed them had lost everything. The revenge was complete, justice had been served, and Roland Livingston had proven that betrayal carried a price too high for anyone to pay. He had protected his family, punished his enemies, and emerged not weakened, but strengthened by the battle. In the end, that was all that mattered: family, loyalty, and the knowledge that no one would ever dare to threaten them again. Epilogue. 10 years later, Roland Livingston stood at the podium of the prestigious Architectural Award ceremony, accepting his Lifetime Achievement Award. At 55, his dark hair now carried distinguished streaks of silver at the temples, but his presence remained commanding, his reputation more formidable than ever. Success isn't built on compromises, he told the audience. It's built on unwavering principles and absolute loyalty. The crowd applauded, unaware of the deeper meaning behind his words. In the front row, 25-year-old Ingrid Livingston watched her father with pride. She had grown into a striking woman, her intelligence and determination evident in her bearing. After the ceremony, they met in his private office at Livingston Architectural Enterprises, now one of the largest firms in the country. Impressive speech, Dad, Ingrid said, settling into her usual chair. As the company's chief technology officer, she had transformed their technological capabilities while maintaining their security with the same vigilance she'd shown in her youth. How's the foundation doing? Roland asked, referring to the Livingston Family Foundation, their organization dedicated to helping children from broken homes. Growing stronger each year. We're opening 3 new centers next month. Ingrid pulled up the statistics on a tablet. We've helped over 10,000 families so far. Roland nodded, satisfied. Their past pain had been transformed into something meaningful, though he had never softened his stance on betrayal. Have you heard the latest about Scott Costa? Ingrid asked, her voice neutral. Roland's expression hardened slightly. Michael mentioned something. Scott Costa had been released from prison 2 years ago after serving 8 years for fraud, attempted intimidation, and various financial crimes. He had emerged a broken man, his once powerful empire reduced to ashes. His attempts to rebuild had been met with closed doors and cold shoulders, Roland's influence ensuring that Costa remained a pariah in the business world. He tried to approach one of our smaller contractors, Ingrid continued. They refused his business immediately and reported it to us. Good. Roland's voice carried the same steel. It had a decade ago. Some debts can never be repaid. The conversation turned to Brenda. After serving 5 years for financial fraud, she had attempted to rebuild her life in another city. Her social status was gone. Her former friends, having long abandoned her, recent reports suggested she worked as a sales clerk in a modest department store. A far cry from her days of luxury and privilege. She sent another letter, Ingrid mentioned, to the foundation this time. Roland raised an eyebrow. Over the years, Brenda had made numerous attempts at reconciliation, all met with silence. Her betrayal had earned her a permanent exile from their lives. I handled it, Ingrid assured him. She won't be contacting us again. Michael Dugan entered the office, now a senior partner in his law firm, but still Roland's closest friend and advisor. The years had only strengthened their bond, forged in loyalty and tested by fire. "The Anderson merger is ready," he announced and smiled. "But that can wait. We're celebrating tonight. Remember?" Roland allowed a small smile. The annual dinner at his home had become a tradition, a gathering of those who had proven their loyalty through the years. Alexander Hubbard's name occasionally appeared in social columns, though her influence had never recovered from Roland's systematic destruction of her reputation. She had learned the hard way that betrayal carried consequences that lasted a lifetime. Later that evening, Roland's expansive home filled with trusted friends and colleagues. The gathering represented the new life he had built, one founded on earned trust and proven loyalty. "Remember that journalist Margie Cherry?" Michael asked during dinner. "She's writing a book about business ethics, wants to interview you." Again. Roland considered this March's article years ago had been fair, presenting the facts while allowing readers to draw their own conclusions about justice and revenge. Set it up, he decided some stories deserved to be told. Ingrid engaged in conversation with her own protege. A young tech expert she was mentoring caught her father's eye across the room. They shared a moment of understanding. The past had shaped them, but it hadn't defined them. The Livingston name now stood for more than revenge. It represented excellence, integrity, and unwavering principles. Roland had built an empire greater than Scott Costa had ever imagined, while his enemies had been reduced to cautionary tales. "Dad," Ingrid approached later when the guests had gone. "I've been thinking about expanding the Foundation's reach. There's a need for programs helping people rebuild after betrayal." Roland studied his daughter, brilliant, strong, and carrying the same steel in her spine that he taught her. "Tell me more." As they discussed plans for the future, Roland reflected on the decade that had passed. His revenge had been complete, but it had also been a beginning. He had shown the world that loyalty mattered, that betrayal carried consequences, and that strength came from unwavering principles. In his private study, a framed article hung on the wall, Margie Cherry's piece titled "The Price of Betrayal, The Livingston Legacy." It served as a reminder that justice, while cold, was absolute. The next morning brought news that Scott Costa had been seen drinking alone in a cheap bar, muttering about past glories. His attempt to write a memoir had been rejected by publishers, his story interesting only as a warning about the cost of crossing the wrong man. Roland read the report without emotion. He had long since moved beyond the need for active revenge. His enemies' continued suffering was simply the natural consequence of their choices. "Mr. Livingston," his assistant's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your daughter's team has detected an attempt to access old company files. They traced it to Brandis' location. Handle it according to protocol," Roland instructed. The years hadn't softened his approach to security or threats. That afternoon he met with the board of directors, presenting plans for the company's continued expansion. The room held the same respect for him it had a decade ago, perhaps more, as his reputation for both excellence and implacable response to betrayal had only grown. "The cost of development properties we acquired have been completely transformed." His VP of operations reported all traces of their former owner have been erased. Roland nodded, satisfied. He had systematically purchased and rebuilt everything Scott had once owned, turning failed projects into successful developments that stood as monuments to his victory. In the evening, he reviewed applications for the Foundation Scholarship Program. Each story of a child affected by betrayal strengthened his conviction that their work mattered. "These kids deserve a chance," Ingrid said, joining him in the review. "Like you gave me." Roland looked at his daughter, his greatest achievement and strongest ally. "We give them more than a chance, we teach them strength." The years had proven that revenge properly executed could build as well as destroy. The Livingston Empire stood as testament to this truth. While their enemies continued, downfall served as a warning to others who might consider betrayal. Michael arrived for their weekly dinner carrying a file. "Remember that offshore account we froze 10 years ago? Costas' lawyers are still trying to unlock it." Roland's smile was cold. "Let them try." The conversation turned to the future, new projects, expanding influences, strengthening alliances. Roland had built something unshakable, founded on the lessons of betrayal but growing beyond them. In her own office, Ingrid monitored the digital security that protected their empire. Her technical skills had grown with the years, creating an impenetrable shield around everything they had built. A message from one of her monitoring systems caught her attention. Alexandra Hubbard had been trying to rebuild connections with their social circle. "Still playing games," Ingrid murmured, setting in motion protocols that would quietly close those doors. The sun set over the city's skyline, glinting off the Livingston Tower that dominated the business district. In his office, Roland reviewed plans for their next major project, a development that would further cement their legacy. "Sir," his assistant appeared at the door. "Your grandson is here." Roland's expression softened slightly as 5-year-old James ran into the office. The boy had his mother's intelligence and his grandfather's determination. The next generation of the Livingston legacy teaching him early, Michael asked, entering behind the child. He needs to understand what matters, Roland replied, loyalty, principle, consequences. The boy already showed signs of understanding, displaying the same quiet strength that characterized his family. Roland had ensured that the lessons of the past would protect future generations. Later that night, as Roland prepared to leave the office, he received one final report. Scott Costa had been denied a business loan, his 7th rejection that year. Brenda's latest attempt to contact them had been blocked before it reached them. Alexandra's social media following had dropped again. He closed the file without comment. Their fates had been sealed by their choices. Their continued struggles, merely the echo of justice served long ago. The decade had transformed everything except Roland's fundamental nature. He remained unforgiving toward betrayal, absolute in his principles and protective of what he had built. His enemies had learned too late that some men couldn't be betrayed without consequences that lasted a lifetime. As he drove home, the city lights reflected off buildings bearing the Livingston name. He had turned revenge into an empire, justice into a legacy, and betrayals, lessons into strength that would echo through generations. The story of Roland Livingston had become more than a tale of revenge. It stood as a testament to the power of unwavering principles, the importance of loyalty, and the absolute certainty that actions carried consequences that time could not erase. In his study that night, Roland looked at a family photo himself, injured her husband and young James. They represented everything he had protected, and built proof that from betrayal's ashes, something stronger could rise. The empire he had built would stand for generations, guided by the principles he had proven through fire, loyalty above all, betrayal without forgiveness, and strength that never wavered. Roland Livingston. Revenge had ended long ago, but its lessons would echo forever. In the end, that was his greatest victory, not just destroying his enemies, but building something unshakable from the ruins of their betrayal. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. Good luck.